Two bodies, a house locked from the inside, and a suspect that no one would have suspected. This is true crime of the historical kind. You are listening to The Strange Case of Lizzie Borden, Part 2, The Trial of the Century. Bridget Sullivan had just laid down in her attic room, feeling the toll of the morning's chores and the lingering queasiness from recent illness, when the city hall bell struck 11. Moments later, Lizzie's voice called up from below, urgent yet oddly composed. "Come down quick, father's dead. Someone came in and killed him." Bridget hurried out of bed. At the foot of the stairs, she saw Lizzie standing by the back screen door, her back to it. Bridget moved toward the sitting room and caught sight of Andrew Borden's body on the sofa, covered in blood. She recoiled but didn't linger. Lizzie urged her, "Don't go in. I have to go get a doctor quick. Go over. I have got to get the doctor." Bridget rushed out the door across the street to Dr. Bowen's house. She banged on the door and told his wife the urgent news, but the doctor wasn't home. So, with no choice, she hurried back to the Bordens. In those brief moments while Bridget was away, the neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Churchill, saw Lizzie from her kitchen window, standing inside the Borden screen door, and appeared unsettled. Adelaide called out across the yard, asking her what's the matter. Lizzie turned and replied faintly, "Oh, Mrs. Churchill, do come over. Someone has killed father." Adelaide hurried over and entered the house. She found Lizzie near the stairs, composed but pale. When Adelaide asked her where her father was, Lizzie pointed, telling her he was in the sitting room. Adelaide glanced in, but could already tell the horror was too much to take in fully. After what seemed like forever, Dr. Bowen arrived. He examined Andrew's body and pronounced him dead. Of course, by murder. By noon, the quiet neighborhood of 2nd Street had become a scene of confusion and dread. The police had arrived quickly. They stepped into the house to find Andrew's body lying in the sitting room where he had fallen. His face was almost unrecognizable from the ferocity of the blows. Upon searching the house, they found another shock. Upstairs, Abby's body was found in the guest bedroom, with the same obvious cause of death. They now knew both the Bordens had been murdered. There was such an immediacy to discovering the death of Mr. Borden, and everything had pointed to this just happening. But upon finding Abby's body, perception of the crime scene changed completely. Unlike Mr. Borden, Abby's body was surrounded by coagulated blood, betraying that she had been dead much longer than Andrew, hours perhaps. As they searched the rest of the home, they couldn't comprehend what they were finding or not finding. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, nothing that suggested an intruder had come or gone. Inside, the rooms looked normal. Nothing looked ransacked, only quiet. The police could already tell the murders were probably committed by an axe or some similar weapon. As they searched the cellar, they located several sharp tools that could be potential murder weapons. But what made them pause was a broken hatchet. The blade looked as though it had been covered in ash, and it looked as though someone had broken the handle deliberately, maybe to disguise it or explain away the bloodstains, because there was no visible blood on the tools. The lack of blood throughout the house in general was confusing. There was no blood trail or smears on doorknobs, no bloody footprints, and Lizzie herself was clean. And there wouldn't have been much time for a cleanup. What they did find in the cellar was a pail of blood-stained cloths. At least at first, it looked exactly like the kind of evidence they were searching for, a sign that someone had attempted to clean up the crime scene. But when they questioned Lizzie, she told them they were menstrual rags. She was, as they would say, down sick, which is a discreet Victorian phrasing for her monthly cycle. Questions about a woman's menstruation were not the kind of thing Victorian men pursued, especially with a woman of Lizzie's social standing. And so they dropped it. When the police pressed Lizzie for what she saw or heard, her story was inconsistent. She said her father had come home and he had laid on the couch for a nap. She explained that Abby had been out and Lizzie was in the barn looking for fishing irons. But when they searched the barn, they found that it was dusty without recent footprints. And how could she have been throughout the house without ever seeing Abby's body? But to be fair, Bridget didn't see the body either. though Lizzie had said that Bridget had been outside washing the windows. All in all, her story just did not seem to add up. And so the search ended where it began, with two bodies hacked to death in a house without forced entry. Meanwhile, Lizzie's demeanor seemed puzzling. To some, she seemed unnervingly calm. To others, she was dazed and detached, which could be clear signs of shock. A sneaking suspicion was building with the investigators. It would be an almost incredulous accusation. But they couldn't deny that the evidence was pointing to Lizzie, and only Lizzie, as she was the only one with the opportunity to kill her father and stepmother. Had the evidence shown that Abby had been killed right as Mr. Borden had, that could create some plausibility that a crazy man had some berserker attack on the family, then escaped undetected. But no, the killer would have been in the house for at least an hour, if not longer, after killing Abby. The killer would have had to somehow avoid the movement of Bridget and Lizzie, attack Mr. Borden, and evade being seen again as he ran out. The house guest, John Morse, had a solid alibi of being on the other side of town. And as we know, Emma wasn't even in Fall River. She was quickly notified of the deaths and returned home. Police hoped she'd have some information to explain this horrific scene. There were still so many unanswered questions. It quickly became the talk of the town as word spread of the murders. The public's reaction was intense. People feared that Fall River had their very own Jack the Ripper, which happened only a few years earlier and was still fresh on everyone's mind. And you can listen to episodes 6 and 7 for more on Jack the Ripper. But what was so prominent in this Victorian era was that the brutality and senselessness of the crime, though hard to comprehend, would be seen by the public as a masculine crime. The thought that a woman could do this was nearly unheard of, let alone a woman of Lizzie's class. The prejudice at the time would be more likely to blame an immigrant man, had there been anyone to blame. There really wasn't any serious suspicion of Bridget, but as an Irish woman, she would have been seen as more plausible than Lizzie. So, lucky for her, by Lizzie's own account, Bridget was said to have not been in the house. There simply wasn't another serious suspect. Within a few days of the murders came the funeral for Andrew and Abby Borden. The service was held inside the family home of 92 Second Street, in the same room where Mr. Borden had been killed. Outside, crowds pressed around the perimeter, craning for a glimpse. Reporters and townspeople alike came to witness the strange intersection of grief and spectacle that had overtaken the city. Lizzie and Emma stood at the center of it all, clad in black and composed. When the ceremony concluded, the coffins were carried to Oak Grove Cemetery, where Andrew and Abby were laid to rest. What they didn't know at the time was that the bodies in the caskets were headless. During the autopsies, the heads had been removed for further analysis. Now people's focus shifted to try to figure out what exactly happened. Public suspicion was running high as neighbors and newspapermen debated back and forth on how an intruder could have committed such crimes in broad daylight, then just vanished without a trace. The local press condemned the investigation as timid and inept, accusing authorities of being paralyzed by the Borden social standing. People wanted to know, why had no one been arrested? The truth was that the police wanted to find the suspect too. Yet, as they uncovered the evidence, it was becoming more and more uncomfortable with who the details pointed towards. All they could do was ask for details and collect testimony, hoping that there would be some explanation. Yet, when police questioned Emma, she told them that there had been no threats, no enemies, or no reason at all as to why any of them would be in danger. She said her father was strict, certainly, but fair in his way. Not a man to make enemies, as she put it. When questioned about Abby, she was a little more reserved. She admitted that she and Lizzie were not close with their stepmother, but insisted that there was no open conflict. She told them that her sister was steady-minded, not prone to sudden anger, and that she had never known Lizzie to harm anyone. The older sister clearly did not suspect Lizzie, or at least she did not lead on that she did. Regardless, the police had a job to do. On August 9th, an inquest was held at the 2nd District Court in Fall River to determine the deaths of the Bordens and take testimony and evidence. Under oath, Lizzie's testimony remained contradictory. She maintained that she did not know where her stepmother was that morning, that she spoke briefly to her father, took his shoes off before he settled into a nap, though he was found with his shoes on, that she had been in the barn, but the barn looked undisturbed, then that she was in the kitchen, then at the foot of the stairs. What was clear here was that she and only she was in the house for the entirety of the morning. Even if she had gone in the barn, it was only brief. To those in attendance, it was noted that she seemed confused or evasive. It was later learned that she had been given morphine by her physician to calm her nerves during the inquest. Her testimony would be later ruled inadmissible on ineffective counsel. Though in real time, the district attorney believed that they had enough evidence and ordered Lizzie's arrest. She was taken into custody on August 11th. To arrest a woman on these sort of charges at Lizzie's social standing was just so scandalous. And of course, people couldn't get enough of it. Lizzie was taken to jail where she would remain through the fall and winter as she awaited the decision of a grand jury in Bristol County. There had been a stall in the proceedings until a woman with a guilty conscience came forward. Lizzie's friend and neighbor, Alice Russell, who Lizzie had told that she felt like something might happen to her father, her family, right before the murders, shared something that would be like a knife in the back to her friend. Alice told police that days after the murder, she was staying with Lizzie to comfort her in her grief when she saw Lizzie burn a blue dress on the stove. Could this explain the lack of blood on Lizzie immediately following the murders? She may have changed out of the blood soaked dress, hid it away somewhere, then called for help. And once the coast was clear, then tried to destroy the evidence. It was a deep blow to Lizzie's case and helped the proceedings move along. And so, with this new evidence, the jurors reconvened. The decision was made to indict Lizzie on charges of murder for Andrew and Abby Borden. Despite there only being circumstantial evidence, it was too heavy to ignore, and Lizzie pled not guilty, meaning she would now go on trial for her life. That would come nearly a year after the murders. The proceedings opened on June 5th, 1893, at the Bristol County Superior Court in New Bedford. It had been chosen over Fall River for its larger, more neutral venue and its capacity to accommodate the flood of journalists and spectators who would now descend upon the city. This trial would captivate the country and has been called many times the trial of the century. The public struggled to reconcile with the thought of this being a capital case. Culturally, juries would be unlikely to support a woman being executed. This was a time where women were honestly seen somewhat like children, as if they didn't have the full comprehension of what crimes they committed. Needless to say, the public discourse was endless, and the courtroom was now the best ticket in town. In the gallery, society ladies would now have to rub shoulders with mill workers as they all craned for a glimpse of the woman at the center of it all. Lizzie Borden entered the courtroom flanked by her attorneys, including former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, one of the most respected legal minds in the state. She was dressed in somber black and gloves she wore throughout the whole trial, despite it being summer. She appeared calm, her expression restrained, and her demeanor was impeccable. The prosecution, who was led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, laid out the state's case with precision. They presented the hatchets found in the cellar, the burned blue dress, the recent illness in the home, and Lizzie's conflicting statements as a pattern of deceit. Though they attempted to present the evidence of Lizzie attempting to buy prussic acid the day before the murders, Lizzie's defense denied the event even occurred, and even if it did, it was not what killed the Bordens anyway. And the judge agreed. To avoid unfair prejudice, he barred the testimony altogether. So even though there had been testimony that Lizzie had come into the shop asking for prussic acid to clean a sealskin cape, the jurors would never hear it. The prosecution charged on anyway, arguing that Lizzie had both motive and opportunity. They hinted at the illness in the house being a possible attempt at poisoning, and when she failed at that, she picked up the hatchet. They talked about the resentment over her father's frugality and favoritism, that she wanted the inheritance for herself. She didn't want to share anything with her stepmother, and she had the chance to do it. Though points were being made, the trial seemed to become not if Lizzie had committed these crimes, but about if a woman was even capable. The prosecution honed in on the fact that Lizzie was admittedly menstruating during the murders. For the prosecution, they laid out how a woman is not in her right mind during this phase of being. In a court being fully operated by men, the judge, the attorneys, every single juror, it's almost comical to imagine them debating with such ferocity over things they simply didn't understand. It almost sounded like they were describing women as mythical werewolves who would evolve or devolve into monsters along the cycle of the moon. The defense, on the other hand, used Lizzie's menstruation as proof that she didn't commit the crime because it explained the blood soaked claws in the cellar, the bit of blood that was found on her inner thigh. They leaned into the concepts of a woman being simply incapable, both mentally and physically, of swinging a hatchet with such force and swift succession. The case really dug into criminology of the late 1800s, the concepts of masculine crime versus feminine crime, which could be because the cultural backdrop was a time where people were digesting Darwinism and exploring scientific explanations for human behavior, like the Labrosian theory that comes from Cesar Lombroso. He had published his book, The Criminal Man, in 1876. His theory explains the concept of a born criminal that suggests criminals are born as genetic bad apples, basically, and that their physical features can be evidence of them being from a primitive evolutionary stage. So, facial features like broad foreheads or low sunken eyes. In women, it would be a strong jawline or asymmetry, or if she just had masculine features in general. We call it pseudoscience now, but it's possible that this all male jury looked upon a civilized, respectable woman and they may have focused more on that appearance than the evidence. All the observers were watching Lizzie's every move. They scrutinized every facial expression, just waiting for her to react or not react. Some felt that she was being far too brave for a woman to sit there so calmly when such horrors were being discussed. Others saw her calm demeanor as proof of her civility. It wasn't until an especially morbid part of the trial that Lizzie had any reaction at all. The prosecution brought in the skeletal heads of Andrew and Abby Borden to display in front of the court. It showed the damage to their skulls and the sheer brutality it took to inflict it. There was an audible gasp from the gallery, and the ever stoic Lizzie fainted. This may have actually helped Lizzie in the eyes of her critics and perhaps members of the jury because she finally seemed human and, more importantly to them, feminine. Victorian women were famously prone to fainting, or at least that's what the era's novels, diaries, and etiquette manuals would have you believe. The truth is a little more complicated than that. Some of these fainting spells were absolutely real. Corsets in the late 19th century were often worn tightly enough to compress the rib cage and limit the diaphragm. So, when a woman was overheated, as this court was, or anxious, or had gone too long without food, a faint could be a real physiological response. At the same time, like in any time and culture, some expressions are performative, or at least it's a combination of the two. In Victorian society, fainting had become a sort of social language, a way for women to signal shock, distress, or refusal in a world where raising one's voice or simply showing anger was considered unladylike. A faint had the power to halt an uncomfortable conversation, deflect an accusation, or express a feeling a woman wasn't allowed to say out loud. By the 1890s, when Lizzie Borden stood trial, fainting was still woven into the expectations of feminine behavior. If she stayed stoic, she risked being seen as cold and unfeminine. But if she fainted, it could also be read as hysteria or guilt. It's safe to say Victorian womanhood was a narrow stage, and fainting could be a cultural script. So women, whether they wanted to or not, were expected to perform it. The trial continued as the prosecution laid out their case. With the testimony, evidence, and argument, it was clear that there really was no one else that could have done this. But the defense had its own strength. Robinson and his team painted Lizzie as a devout, charitable, and refined woman, incapable of such brutality. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence, the lack of bloodstains, and no eyewitnesses. They suggested that the investigation had been botched from the start and tainted by bias. After 14 long days, the jury in the trial of Lizzie Andrew Borden retired to deliberate. They returned with an answer barely an hour and a half later. When the clerk rose and read the verdict, not guilty on both accounts of murder, the courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Lizzie's composure finally seemed to break. Her shoulders trembled and she clasped her hands to her face, weeping quietly as her sister Emma, who had supported her the entire time, rushed to her side. Outside of the courthouse, the crowds were waiting to hear what the headlines would proclaim within hours: Lizzie Borden acquitted. To her supporters, the verdict restored justice and decency. To her detractors, it confirmed their darkest suspicion that wealth, womanhood, and respectability had shielded her from the gallows. Either way, the trial's end did nothing to stop the fascination. Lizzie left the courthouse a free woman, but the name Borden, that once meant order and respectability, would forever come with the dark cloud of the murders. In Fall River, the polite routines of everyday life resumed, but nothing would ever feel the same again. Not entirely. In the months that followed her acquittal, Lizzie and Emma Borden withdrew into the confines of Second Street, but soon decided to remake their lives, or try to, up on the hill. Finally. With the death of the Bordens, the inheritance was passed to the sisters, which in today's money would be worth millions. They purchased a grand gabled home on French Street and named it Maplecroft. The house was everything that their fathers had never been: spacious, elegant, fitted with fine woodwork, indoor plumbing, and all the modern comforts that Andrew Borden had so stubbornly rejected. For the first time in her life, Lizzie lived with the outward signs of wealth her family had long possessed but never displayed. In public records and in her correspondences, she began calling herself Lizbeth A. Borden. Which makes you wonder, why not leave Fall River altogether, go to Europe, and completely reinvent yourself? According to Lizzie, she had nothing to run from. She did nothing wrong. And while the initial relief of her being acquitted soothed some of the ideals of propriety, her reputation was too stained to ever truly fit in. The same churchwomen who had once sat beside her in the pews now avoided her. Invitations seemed to cease, and whispers followed her wherever she went. There were even rumors that she had stolen 2 paintings, which could have been a misunderstanding or something blown out of proportion because of her infamy. By all accounts, she quietly gave to charity, supported the arts, and hosted small gatherings for a handful of loyal friends. Emma remained her constant companion, at least for a time. Inside Maplecroft, life unfolded in private. Whatever truth the years might have revealed, we just don't know. But what we do know is that Lizbeth, now in her mid-40s, had begun to move in different circles than her sister. Among them was Nance O'Neill, a striking, charismatic stage actress whose friendship with Lizbeth soon became the subject of gossip. To Emma, who was reserved and deeply conservative, these new associations were maybe too much for her. And the sisters had a falling out. Perhaps over propriety or maybe unspoken tension. But whatever was said, it ended 40 years of companionship. Emma packed her belongings and left Maplecroft without fanfare. She never returned, and the 2 sisters never spoke again. For the rest of her life, Lizbeth remained alone in the great house. Her parties were fewer, and her circle got smaller. By the mid-1920s, Lizbeth A. Borden was now an aging woman in frail health. Her world was reduced to quiet rooms of Maplecroft and the company of her servants. Outside of Maplecroft, Fall River had changed. The mills were beginning to decline, and the city's old families were moving away. In the early hours of a June morning, Lizbeth Andrew Borden died of pneumonia in her home at Maplecroft. She was 66 years old, and for nearly half of her life, she had lived beneath the shadow of a story that refused to fade. When her will was read, it reflected both the solitude and the quiet compassion of her later years. Her estate was valued at more than $250,000, which would be about over $4 million today. It was distributed with care to friends and staff and generous amounts for animal welfare organizations and funds for perpetual upkeep of her father and stepmother's graves. Notably, she left nothing to her sister Emma, though that wouldn't be necessary, as Emma herself died just 9 days later. The sisters had separate funerals and were buried in Oak Grove Cemetery near their parents' graves. Officially, the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden were never solved, though the dark Victorian nursery rhyme that we all know reflects what the public has always believed: that Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. In truth, Abby Borden suffered 19 whacks and Andrew 10 or 11. But was it Lizzie? This is true crime of the historical kind. If you enjoyed this, please send this to someone who you think might like this podcast. It would be so helpful. And of course, make sure to follow. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, bye.